now I would like to invite Chie Togami to come forward to share with us about intentional communities, a lifestyle built for conscious sharing. Let's welcome her.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here this morning. I'm truly honored to be a part of this year's fanfare, and I really mean it when I say that I believe in this kind of work and the awareness that this organization is bringing to the region. It's a wonderful feeling to look out and see all your faces, and I'm well aware that there are a million and one things you could have been doing this morning, and you chose to be here and to learn and to expand your horizons. And you know, this is absolutely crucial because our society faces many huge and sometimes seemingly insurmountable challenges. Our environment and our atmosphere have been trashed. As a people, we are more tired, sicker, and lonelier than in past generations. And I bet many of you, like me, have felt a call to work for change. And that's part of the reason why you're here. And I'm here today to talk about intentional communities and sharing initiatives. But I'd just like to take a minute to tell you about the journey that brought me to have this passion about intentional communities. When I went off to college as a freshman, I had a very clear idea that I wanted to major in environmental policy and that I wanted to become an environmental lawyer, and so I could sue the bad corporations and that were wreaking havoc on nature and poisoning people and so forth. And if you'd asked me then about poverty, fair trade, AIDS, domestic violence, human trafficking, all these other big issues, I cared, but I felt that those were battles that others were called to fight. And my fight was for the environmental team. And I was really stuck in this divided mindset until I sat down to write a paper about mountaintop removal in Appalachia. And I tried to understand the issues at hand. And I kept jumping from economics to poverty to endangered species to fossil fuel reliance to corporations in this web that refused to be untangled. And that's when I came across this really helpful visual, which many of you have probably already seen, which did a really good job illustrating the relationship between society and environmental issues. And it's called the sustainability triangle. And as you can see, you can't have sustainability without equal consideration for the economic, environment, and socio-cultural realities. So this was the first piece in helping me to situate the environmental problem within the landscape of society and values. And the second great insight came to me during one summer when I was working as a policy and legislation intern at Earth Justice in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who don't know, Earth Justice is the premier environmental law firm in the country that also has a branch that does lobbying on behalf of environmental pieces of legislation. And part of my job as an intern was to cold call senator and representatives' offices, inform them of upcoming votes, and ask them to either vote in favor or against certain environmentally related bills. And then when time came, everyone in the office would gather around a television to watch CNET and watch as the senators and representatives cast their votes, and we would keep a tally as they walked up. And to set the scene, the summer of 2011 was an absolutely terrible year for environmental legislation. We lost almost every important vote that I can recall. And I remember on one particular day, I went to the kitchen to get some coffee during a particularly important vote, and I heard cheers, and so I rushed back into the lobby because I thought we had finally won a vote. And I asked, did we win? Did we win? And I'll never forget, one of my colleagues turned to me, absolutely beaming, and she said, no, but we didn't lose by as much as we thought we would. and it just hit me. The irony that it was so dire that we were celebrating margins of loss, not victory, loss. And by the end of that summer, I'd become really disillusioned with the idea of affecting real and lasting change through policy, through the top-down approach. Because working on Capitol Hill, I saw firsthand how the machinations of politics and corporations and money or working against the interests of the people every day. And I really like this flow chart because I think it sums up things pretty well. You know, we, the people, spend money and we give it to the government, who then give it to the fossil fuel industries, and then they give money to the congressmen and the senators, who then vote for subsidies for those same fossil fuel industries. And you can really substitute almost anything for fossil fuel industries. You can talk about big pharma, you can talk about big agriculture, etc. It pretty much functions all the same way. And so all my dreams were kind of crushed by this cynical realization. And I decided I didn't want to pursue law. And part of that was because environmental lawyers really do sit at desks all day. I think I had some romantic visions of consorting with beasts in Yosemite as I was writing legal briefs, but that's not how it is. And so I was back to square one, and I began to do a lot of thinking about grassroots initiatives and just the most basic idea that if we all shared more resources, many of the problems that we face as a society could be curtailed or greatly reduced. And the more I thought about this, the more I really wanted to find an example of a small society where this was being modeled. And this line of inquiry eventually led me to a topic which I'm here to discuss today, which is the concept of intentional communities. And intentional community is a broad term which describes a group of people who've chosen to live together with a common purpose, working cooperatively to create a lifestyle that reflects their shared core values. And there are all kinds of intentional communities, and some of them I've listed here. You have ecovillages, which are generally communities with a strong ecological focus. You have co-housing communities, which generally incorporate both private homes and shared common facilities and support neighborly connections. Communes, communities which indicate that they're generally 100% income sharing. Co-ops, cooperatives, generally expense sharing, often urban, sharing housing communities. Many of those listed in the IC directory, which is the Intentional Communities directory online, are like college students and tend to be urban. And then religious communities. And we often think of monastic arrangements, convents, kibbutz, and historic communities like the Shakers and the Hutterites and the Amish. And then there are some that don't fall strictly into these categories and that blend aspects of each. However, one thing they all have in common is sharing. And when I was designing my study of intentional communities, I wanted to look at 3 specific ways that communities embody the practice of sharing. 1, shared income, 2, shared ownership, and 3, shared resources. And if you think of these as kind of being on a scale, 1 being the most radical, sharing income with non-relatives in our society is still pretty outside the box. On the next level down is shared ownership, and the most basic of these is resource sharing, which could be anything from sharing a lawnmower, sharing a community garden space, etc. So in the next part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about several of the communities I visited and how they embodied one or all of these kinds of sharing. So, and a quick background on this study. I was given a grant by my university to spend a year studying intentional communities around the world. I was based in Japan, New Zealand, Scotland, and Germany. And I can't talk about all the communities I've visited, so I've chosen a selection to share with today. So the first place I visited was the Konohana family Ecovillage. It was founded in 1994, so it's about 21 years old. And it was founded by 3 couples in the Fujinomiya region of Japan. You can actually see Mount Fuji right there in the background. It's in the foothills of the mountain. It's very beautiful. And there are about 86 members, and they are income sharing. So when you join Konohana, you basically commit to giving all of your financial assets to the community. And the way it was explained to me is that you maintain your own bank account, but you can be called upon at any time, tapped, for instance, to give a donation of, whatever they need. So when I was there, they were building a new residential complex, and so one person who was a particularly successful businessman before he joined the community was asked to give $250,000, and he gave it. There was controversy later, but that's outside the scope of this. And I think they do like a probationary, like 1 year, you live there and you work, and then after that you kind of discern whether it's the place for you and whether you're going to join. They are supported through selling produce. So they have a method of farming which just uses minimal inputs. They actually don't use any kind of like manure. They believe in cultivating the microbes in the soil. It's based on the principles of effective microorganisms, and so they feed the microorganisms with this brew that they concoct. It's kind of like a fermented thing, and then they spread that on the soil, and they are able to produce large amounts of organic produce. It's pretty impressive. And they have this sort of niche market because this area is home to a lot of Buddhist and Shinto temples, and so when they have any kind of gathering, they get a lot of their food catered by Konohana because it's seen as spiritually imbued because it was grown in the foothills of Mount Fuji, which is a sacred area of Japan. That's another picture. This is a potato harvest, which I participated in. So you can see they do use motorized equipment, but it's all communally owned, and they really try to minimize their ecological footprint. That's a potato. I mean, if you think about that, that's bigger than his head. So this place was very, very different. It was a complete culture shock for me. When I arrived there, I was under the impression I was going to have my own room, and they were like, no, you're going to be sharing a room with someone. So I was basically moved into someone's personal room, and they do not have individual family dwellings. They all live in like a complex. They actually live in a it was like a nursing home that was converted into a residential area, and so they don't necessarily also believe in typical nuclear family. They're called the Konohana family because they believe that everyone in the family is equal. So every parent, every adult is a parent to every child. And they're really about breaking down the barriers of intense relationships because they want everyone to feel equally related, which you can imagine is a really difficult task in a community that has 86 members. So part of that is that when a child is born in the community, they are cared for by their mother until 6 months of age. And I was told that this was actually because the breast milk is supposed to give them antibodies until 6 months, and then after that it is not as effective or useful. So at that point they're given to a group of women who are designated. Their job within the community is caretakers and nursery ladies, and so they're then raised with a cohort of children around the same age. And as they grow older, they're transitioned to another place where they live and another place. And so parents live separately from their children, and they may interact during meal times or community events, but it's not, they don't live with their parents, which was very shocking for me. But I have to say, I did find that children seemed very well adjusted, and that they didn't seem to be unhappy, and they're constantly being held. I mean, these babies were never put on the ground. Like, there's always someone's arms to fall into. And it was pretty neat because they had the older generation. Some of the nursery ladies were in their 70s and 80s, and they were the ones taking care of the babies. So naturally some of the babies would bond with the older women, and so instead of crawling towards their mom's skirts, they'd be crawling towards their grandmother's skirts or whatever. Anyway, and we also did communal bathing, which is typical of Japanese culture. But when I arrived there, like, okay, it's bath time, get naked, and I'm just walking in there, and there are all these people I've never seen before, and it's just completely normal. So lots of boundaries were coming down. Like I said, a majority of these people work doing farming and that kind of thing. So this is the farm crew taking a tea break. And they worked, really long hours. They were up at 6:30 in the morning and would often be going to bed at midnight. And I would ask them, like, how can you, every day of the week, they had no breaks. And one And I would ask them, how can you do that? Like, I physically could not do that. And they attributed it to their spirituality. And they said, you know, if your soul is right with the divine, then you have endless energy. And that was how they explained it to me. And so community meetings were a big part of this community's life. And they would have meetings every single night for 4 to 5 hours. So it was like dinner at 6, and then at 7 they would start meeting, and that could go on until basically, you know, they had gotten all their issues out or whatever. And it ranged from all kinds of topics of discussion. Oh, this is the nursery. Sorry, these are a lot of order. This is a little child hanging up his cup. They have all their labels, brushing teeth. This is the dinner. This is where they ate all their meals together. They had a team of people whose job was to cook, and they cooked all day long every day, because everything they cooked was made from the stuff that they grew, essentially. They grew over 365 varieties of vegetables and grains. So food. So this is one of the meetings, like I was saying, and so part of their spirituality, and it really didn't fall into, it couldn't be characterized as Buddhist or anything, it was something they'd kind of come up with on their own, but part of it involved criticism. So they would essentially call people out during meetings, and they were very high tech, you know, so they had microphones on every table, and you would stand up and you would say, like, so-and-so did something which hurt my feelings today, and then they would just talk about it for hours and hours and hours and work through it. And sometimes they would draw out from the things that were being said about you, you know, character flaws. They would say, well, this thing, for instance, someone borrowed, so this is a true example, someone borrowed someone else's computer and they left all their tabs open and closed the other people's tabs. Faux pas, right? But, and then they talked about this for about an hour and said, you know, this is representative of the fact that you are not considerate of others' feelings and blah, blah. So this was very foreign to me and very uncomfortable sitting in on, and I feel like they were just airing their dirty laundry. But they had a central figure who kind of headed this up, and that was their spiritual leader. His name was Isidone. This is a picture of him. Speak much longer than anyone else. And I had a translator, but of course a lot of this was lost in translation. And he was kind of the leader, and they went to him for any questions. So yeah, and if you have any more questions about that, I have a lot more to say. But I need to move on to the next. Community. Okay, so you're in Japan, now we're in New Zealand, and this is Riverside Community, which is the oldest community in continuing intentional community in New Zealand, which is one of the reasons I chose it. It was founded in 1941 by Christian pacifists. They were Methodists, and they were conscientious objectors to World War II. And a lot of the wives of people who had been imprisoned came to live here to be supported, to raise their children while their husbands were in prison. And this is also an income-sharing community. They have been since the beginning. They're no longer Christian. They became secular in the 1970s. So, but I would say most people kind of practice like New Age spirituality here. It's really a hodgepodge. That's not the thing that really unites them. I think their main uniting principle is supporting each other and the income-sharing aspect, because living at Riverside, you really don't have much money. Of course, you live in a house, and they do live in nuclear families, so you know every family has their own dwelling and such, but they're given a stipend, and so their main industries are they have a dairy and they have a restaurant, and right now they're actually not doing very well financially. And while I was visiting there, they were kind of in the process of restructuring, and they had been losing hundreds of thousands of dollars because they used to grow fruit, and since the fruit market kind of fell, you know, the bottom fell out of it in New Zealand, they've had to really figure out a new way to make money. So they're exploring different options at this point. And so they collectively decided while I was there to reduce the stipend for each adult that they get. And it's very little. I think it was about $140 every 2 weeks per adult to live on. But you have to consider that they get their housing, their electricity, their water, their food, most of their food. They have a large garden where they grow most of the stuff that they eat, and they also get as much milk as they want, which was pretty awesome, plus raw milk while I was there. And one thing that I really noticed about this community was there was a sense of kind of, this is a map of it, a sense of kind of fatigue of visitors. I think when you're a community for that length of time, you have so many people coming and going. And so, whereas at Konohana, it's kind of new and they were interested in me, at Riverside, I was kind of just like, oh, you're another visitor, you know. And I was there for a couple months. I did woofing, which maybe some of you have heard of. It's worldwide opportunities on organic farms. So in exchange for my keep there, I worked in the garden and did landscaping, that kind of thing, to help them out. And yeah, it was a great exchange. So they do interface with the outside community, which is like Motueka, New Zealand. And just to kind of place this visually, it's at the top of the South Island in New Zealand. They run workshops, which are by donation, and so people from the community can come and learn different things. Like I took a cheese making workshop when I was there. They have yoga classes. They have a circus classes for kids and that kind of thing. And every week they have a community lunch where anyone from the outside community can come and eat. But what I found was really striking was that there were only a couple community members in attendance from Riverside itself. When they would put on these lunches, but then hardly anybody from the community would show up. And I attribute that to the fatigue of just having to be on and having visitors in and out all the time. They have hundreds and thousands of people come through every year. And so this is the community center where they would hold the lunches. And this is also where they have their weekly community meetings. So they meet for about 4 hours a week as compared to Konohana. And they were very insular about it. I asked if I could attend a meeting, and they had to ask if that was going to be okay and get the agreement from everyone there. And then when I did attend, I was only allowed to stay for about 30 minutes, and then they're like, okay, you need to leave now. So I think it's really sensitive for them. And at this point, they actually are not accepting any more members because of the financial straits that they're in. So, thank you. So everything's kind of on hold until they can figure out financially. Which, if we go back to the sustainability triangle and we think about the economic side of things, remaining financially soluble is hugely important for intentional communities and their longevity. Is that one of the community lunches that I mentioned? This is at the cheese making workshop. They had a industrial kitchen, which is pretty neat. These are some of the Riverside kids hanging out. That's actually they have a hostel on the premises for visitors and woofers to stay in. And this is just to give you, an example of one of the family homes. This yellow building is a house where a family of 6 lived, and that's the caravan where I stayed when I was woofing. And it's really hodgepodge. This is another caravan that someone was living in, so it's not very uniform. This is a shot of one of the gardens where they grow their own food, and another picture of the garden. It's very beautiful. And they had a lot of really neat stuff on site. I mean, if you've been there for that many years, you have the opportunity to invest. And this is the joinery, so people needed to do any home improvement projects, woodworking, that kind of thing. They had a resident artist, Che Vincent, who did some really incredible metal working. That was his contribution to the community, and this proceeds from any sale of an art piece would go directly to the community coffers, and then they would divide that. And this is the cafe. And one thing that's interesting to mention is that they had a rule that even if you worked outside the community. So say you worked in the dairy, and everyone who lived there at this time was working in the businesses of the community because they really needed every hand on deck. But even if, for say, you wanted to go play guitar at a pub on the weekends to earn tips or something, they did not allow you to keep that money. Like, every cent that you earned, whether in your free time or whatever, was expected to come back to the community. And if you really think about what that means, if you're living on $140 every 2 weeks, and then I think a smaller stipend for the children, you know, you can't afford to buy big ticket items. Like, you can't get a big screen TV, you can't afford to buy a plane ticket to go on vacation. So when you join this community, you're really committing to this this vow of poverty, in a sense. And I think that they lived really, like, their lives were very rich, but just not monetarily. And that was something I had to think about. You know, could I live like this? And if I really believe all the things I'm saying, then I should aspire to live like this. So it was challenging for me personally. Okay, this is the cactus garden. Che Vincent, the artist, also cultivated all of these cacti, and I just thought they were amazing. And that's the Riverside milk stand. Okay. The next place I visited was Findhorn Ecovillage, which maybe some of you have heard of. It's very well known. It was founded in 1962 by 3 Christian mystics, Peter and Eileen Caddy and Dorothy McLean. And I visited for 1 week doing the Ecovillage Experience Week. And our guide, Craig, who I think I have a picture in here somewhere, took us out to the shoreline because he really wanted us to see what the first people saw when they arrived on this spot. And it's truly barren. There were very few trees. This is a floodplain. And it continues to flood every year. So driftwood, not much. But for some reason, they felt really drawn to this spot, and they decided that they wanted to live here. And interestingly, unlike the other 2 places I talked about, this was not conceived of first as a community. It was actually, it just kind of happened that people started flocking to them, and a community was born. And this is Craig. He was my guide on the Ecovillage Experience Week. It's a piece of driftwood. It's his throne. And he has been a member of Findhorn for 40 years. And the way he described it, you know, he's come and he's gone, but this is his home, and he thinks he'll be there until he dies, and he really loves it. That being said, though, he was great at giving true insight into what it is like to live in that community, and he was vocal about some of the criticisms he has, which I'll talk about a little later. So Findhorn, it was so different because it was so developed in comparison to the communities. I mean, they have hundreds of people who are part of this community, but unlike Riverside and Konohana, where you're a member or you're not a member, there were so many levels of involvement. So there are people who had moved to the region to be part of the community, but who weren't income-sharing members, and you had people who lived there for 40 years and who were income-sharing members, or had once been income-sharing members and then were no longer. It was almost too much to wrap your head around. And then they throw into that mix, they had a foundation, the Findhorn Foundation, which was a nonprofit, but then they also had for-profit businesses. And so it was very complex. So I don't even know if I'll be able to communicate it all to you very clearly, but I'll do my best. And so they're a registered eco-village, which means that they fulfill certain aspects of ecological building principles. I think it also includes the percentage of food that they grow, that they eat. When I asked for a number, Craig told me it was about 40% of the food that's consumed within the Findhorn campus, and they have 2 is grown on site, and the rest they try to source from local farmers as much as possible. I don't know if I mentioned, this is in Scotland, in northern Scotland. This is Colerne, this is one of the gardens. And so there's 2 campuses. One is it's called the Park, which it has a lot of single family dwellings, and that's where you find the Field of Dreams, which is an area that is technically not owned by Findhorn, but the people who live there associate themselves with Findhorn. And this is where it's like a big hodgepodge of eco-building experiments. Some people say horrors because they're huge, huge eco houses, which is a little, ironic. Yeah. So, yeah, eco mansions. And so then you have the other part of Findhorn, which is called Communes. It is an old hotel that the founders acquired and then converted into kind of, a residential hall for the members. And so people who live here, it's like they live in a dorm-like thing. There's a large eating area. It's beautiful. I mean, it was a very fancy hotel. So this is where they eat their meals, 3 meals a day, and they have people who are on staff who cook, who are also members. And I was told that the footprint, the ecological footprint that they count here is actually bolstered by Communes because you have a high density of people living in close quarters versus, and actually the park, which you think of as, the Ecovillage part, is actually much less efficient than all these people living together. So. And so the people who live here are all considered staff of the Findhorn Foundation, and they work either on maintenance, they cook, they lead workshops. The main source of income for Findhorn at the moment is workshops. So they have, if you take Riverside and then expand that out, they get thousands of people, I think over 15,000, 20,000 people who come pilgrimage to Findhorn to see the place and take workshops. And they're very expensive. I don't know if any of you guys have ever considered going to a workshop at Findhorn, but they're, in the $700, $800, $900, $1,000 for 1 week. So it's limiting, if you can't afford that. They do have scholarships, yes, but even still, it just, yeah. And if you take into account the airfare as well to get there. And this is at a meal. So while I was there, they get you to do this thing it's called Love in Action, which is essentially come work for us for free, even though you're paying to be here. But it's presented in a different way. And I didn't mind, but I worked in the kitchen, and so I had to take a picture of one of the lunches that we prepared. This is at the park, and the park is composed of all kinds of different buildings, like I said, very experimental. And one of the things that Ecovillages and intentional communities take advantage of is loopholes, building loopholes. And so one of these is that you don't have to count buildings as permanent if they could theoretically be moved. So this is not going anywhere anytime soon. It's beautiful, it's perfect where it is, but in order to evade taxes or something, or not have too many buildings on a certain area, this could theoretically be moved if it was like put on the back of a truck or something. And so things are like semi-permanent. This is just another example of a little house. And then these are really cool. These are the whiskey barrel houses, and they're made out of whiskey vats. And so there's a whole cluster. Someone, 20, 30 years ago had this idea and talk about tiny homes. But they're beautiful. This is the inside of one. So I think this is Craig's house. This is a view from the roof, so they're in a cluster. And so, like I said, the original founders were Christian mystics, but now Findhorn has become a center for all kinds of eclectic spirituality. And they love celebrations of any kind. So this was the Fall Harvest Festival, which I was there for. And so sang a song, danced in a circle, they put flowers in their hair and got a bunch of food, and then we had a party, and it was awesome. Okay, so now we're going back to New Zealand. And the reason that I separated these, of course I didn't go in that order, but was because I wanted to provide a contrast. So the last 3 communities I talked about were income-sharing communities, and I wanted to show an example of another community I visited which didn't do income sharing, but also there were great benefits from them being a community and sharing resources. So this is the Wairahi community, which is on Great Barrier Island. To get there, you take a ferry from Auckland for about 4 hours. When you arrive, there's a little little tiny port, like the most nondescript little port, and I debarked there, and then my hosts who live in this community picked me up, in their little fishing boat, and we went around the island to their dock, and then we got out, and then we hiked 40 minutes into the bush to get to where they live, and that is how they live. And then you take into account the fact that you can only access their little dock area when the tides are in. So everything is based on the tidal rhythms. And there was one time when my host miscalculated and we literally were just stuck in the mud, and I had to wade in mud up to my knees to the shore and then hike an hour because we couldn't get any closer. And so talk about roughing it. They were pretty intense. So this community was founded in the 1970s, and unlike these other communities I talked about, which kind of had this either shared spirituality or a shared ecological focus, these people were really just, they wanted to go back to the land. They were college students and they couldn't afford it, and so they got together and they decided, let's buy this swath of property on Great Barrier. I think it was former farmland, and so they went in together and they divided it into shares, and they created a liability company, limited liability company. And fast forward 40 years, you have a lot less of them living there. I mean, granted, they're in their 50s and 60s and 70s now. And so to live like that, it's a lot harder when you're older. And so I guess I was thinking about how they were kind of declining. There were only about 6 people who were living there year-round, and I was there during the summer, and so I heard from them that a lot of people tend to move off the island during the winter because, not that it snows or anything, but it's the mud. I mean, these trails just become almost impassable and dangerous. Okay, great. And they don't have, one of their agreements is they don't have any motorized vehicles on their land, and so it's actually sea access only. Just by virtue, that's the only way you can get there. But then once you get there, they have one tractor, and that's for moving really heavy equipment that you can't move. I found one of the members. Is anybody familiar with Xena Warrior Princess? Okay. Well, one of the members that was filmed in New Zealand, I found out, was the animal trainer for Xena Warrior Princess. So he's just living off in the jungle, and he had all these props, from that show, and he was like, yes, I designed Xena's horse, the white horse or whatever. He's like, I picked it out. I was like, cool. And so one of his hobbies is he trains horses to pull carts, and so he had a horse there. So that's part of the way that he built his home, was by using his horses to cart in the materials. And so these people, I think their emphasis is on just self-sufficiency. So Great Barrier Island, I forgot to mention, has no main electricity or main water. So every single house has to be self-sufficient. And the hosts that I lived with did not have a refrigerator. They had a couple solar panels, and amazingly, my host was running an internet technology business from which just proves that you can do it anywhere, because he could only work when the sun was high, because literally as soon as the clouds covered the solar panels, it was like, nope, no more internet. But he worked it out, and he had single-handedly brought internet to that area of the island by running cords, and I don't even know. So that just proves you can do it anywhere. And they were actually able to drink water straight out of the stream, no filter, because it was so pure in this area. And so this is another shot of the island. This is the inside of their home. So this is the refrigerator. This is the cool room. And it really was just a room on the coolest part of the house with screens down the side of the walls to allow airflow to go through. And so that meant, they couldn't eat much that could spoil. So when they wanted meat, they had a freezer at the port, and so they would have to, do the whole journey into port to get the meat out of the freezer and then thaw it out and eat it. And the thing that struck me about this was, though, this is a very small house, But yeah, again, the quality of life was still really high, even though they had so little. They didn't have all these fancy gadgets. And this is the backyard, and that's actually a vegetable garden using permaculture principles and using the native palms to kind of shade the plants to keep them from the hot sun. There's a little chicken coop in the back. And this is another one of the community members, Lynn, in her house. And I was obsessed with these homes. I just thought they were so cute, and they were all hand built. Her husband built this. Charming. So I'm really sure that I've missed things and you guys have questions. So at this point I just wanted to open it up. Anything and everything you want to ask?
Are there any communes or organizations similar to that in the United States? I mean, back in the 60s, of course, there was quite a few communes, but they all died out, didn't they?
There are quite a lot of intentional communities and communes in the United States. My project, I was not allowed to study in the U.S. I was told that I had to go abroad. And so that's why I focused on these international communities. But I could have just as easily done the same thing in the U.S. As far as income sharing communities, Twin Oaks, which I think is in Virginia, is one of the most well-known income sharing communities, if you're curious. And IC.org is like a directory of intentional communities, and you can find listings.
What is that again?
IC.org. IC, just the letters.
Intentional community, I see.
IC.org.
Mm-hmm. And you can just search on there for hours. There's tons.
There's dozens, if not hundreds.
Oh yeah, I would say hundreds. Yeah.
So I'm fascinated by this. Being that you've spent so much time with these people, what are your overall thoughts? Does this work, or do these people want out and feel stuck, or what do you think?
Which community, or just in general?
Just in general.
I think it can work, but I think that it's often the little things that tear communities apart. Like you think, most people can agree generally on like building for sustainability, but it's the nitpicky things that really tear communities apart, like stuff about dogs. Like at one community I visited, it was like these neighbors were at war because the dogs were eating the native birds, and this woman was a bird lover, and it was just so horrifying to her, and she wanted, no animals. And so you really have to, there's just so much compromise that's involved. And it can work, but again, the whole financial solubility issue, like if you're gonna do this, you really have to have a plan. And I think there's some statistic out there. It's like 90% of intentional communities, prospective intentional communities, fail within the first like 5 to 10 years. So learning from the mistakes of past communities before you go and try to set out your own is really important. And one thing that I took away from this was that I'm interested in living in an intentional community, but I don't think I want to start one. There's so many communities. There's so many communities that were founded and have the resources and have the land, but just don't have the young people and the young energy, and they're aging, and and a lot of people I talk to, they really want young people, but the financial barriers to joining for a lot of these are really high. So, for instance, Wairahi, when they bought the land wasn't worth that much, but now the Great Barrier is up and coming, more people are moving there. Their land has valued to the point. Appreciated to the point where it's like $250,000 a share to buy out one of the older residents. And because it's owned, the financial structure of it is you can't put up a title or a deed as, what's the word I'm thinking of? Collateral, yes, for the bank. So that means you have to pay in cash. So that excludes anyone my age almost, unless they have an inheritance. And there's also another Ecovillage I didn't talk about, another Ecovillage in New Zealand, which it was even higher. It was like $350,000 to get a plot of land within this communally owned place. So.
Did you run across any where it was relatively affordable to join?
There was one, and I think their membership fee was at like $5,000 or something, which is pretty, affordable if you save. but the location was so remote and they didn't have any kind of community business. So their problem was that even though it was affordable to join, there were no economic opportunities for young people, and so there was no impetus to move to that area. Yeah.